Good afternoon, listeners. Welcome to Officer.com and this webinar on Distracted Patrol, Managing the 21st Century Technology Tightrope. Today's presentation is brought to you by L-Tron Corporation, and it's one that's near and dear to my heart. We see too many officers today who don't pay attention to officer survival issues, warning cues, because they're distracted by technology, and that's what today's webinar is going to focus on, is kind of the balance that has to be struck. Our two presenters today are Mr. Christopher Tarantino and Colonel Timothy Albon. He's a colonel retired from the Massachusetts State Police. And at this point, I'm going to turn this over to Mr. Tarantino. Please hold your questions until the end, and we'll have a Q&A session at that time. Chris, if you would, sir.
Thank you so much. Well, welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for taking part in this webinar. I think this is a really, really important topic. What we're going to do today is look at, with a really kind of critical lens, how technology is impacting the patrol environment with today's law enforcement. There are obviously positive attributes of technology, and I think we're pretty familiar with those things. But I think there also needs to be a really hard look at how this is impacting the way law enforcement professionals are doing their job, and how it's actually making things a little bit more difficult, maybe how technology is getting in the way of our traditional law enforcement training. And we'll also talk a little bit about traffic incident management, risk management, and just how technology kind of rolls into all of those concepts. So this is the focus of today's webinar is going to be on distracted patrol. My name is Chris Tarantino. I'm a master exercise practitioner and a crisis management communications professional. Where I kind of come at with this realm is with regard to the technology and communications aspect. I develop and deliver training in emergency management and public safety environments. And so law enforcement professionals all the way down to fire service personnel, emergency medical services as well. And so I work with a company, Epicenter Media and Training. I'm the CEO of that company, and where we come into this is we develop training and exercises that help law enforcement agencies actually utilize the technology in an effective way, ranging from drones and unmanned aerial vehicles to wearable technologies, all the way into a couple other realms like social media as well. With that role, I work with a company called L-Tron Corporation, and I'm their public safety communications consultant. What they do, and L-Tron Corporation comes into this space and they develop, they broadcast, and they actually show people how to use in-car technology such as barcode scanners, in-vehicle printers, computers, and things like that. And they help out with inventory tracking and management, e-citation solutions, et cetera, et cetera. With that, in my response roles, I have roles at every level of government, ranging from the local side all the way up to the state and federal side as well, where I work with incident management teams and large-scale disasters, technology, communications, public information management, et cetera. So that's kind of my realm of things. But I'm going to turn it over really quick for an intro from Colonel Tim Albon. Tim?
Well, thanks so much, Chris, and I want to welcome everyone here this afternoon. My introduction, obviously, I was Colonel and Superintendent of the Massachusetts State Police. I retired from the State Police in July of this year after 32 years of service. So my contribution to this presentation today is going to go back some 30 years and span that 3 decades to talk about some of the operational technology of what it looked like when I started my career in the 1980s as a road trooper, right up to chief executive of a extremely large department here in New England that dealt with this kind of technology and certainly officer safety issues that came with that. And the kinds of things that as an executive or administrator in a large department or even a small department you have to concern yourself with, and it's all about risk management. So I hope to have some insights from the operational end here to the presentation and hopefully leave you with some thoughts about how you can improve that in your own department and for your own officers.
Awesome. And we're going to take a collaborative approach to this webinar. I'm sure we've all been on those webinar or those training sessions where the only thing that keeps you awake is your face hitting the desk because you're falling asleep. We're going to do our best to make sure that that's not this presentation. We're going to try and keep it lively. We're going to bring in some real-world stories and examples. And we're going to collaborate here where I'm not the traditional law enforcement technologist, where Tim comes in and we're going to collaborate to show you that the two worlds do meet very well and very naturally together. So that's kind of why we're here. We're here to kind of usher this conversation along, and we will take questions at the end. So you can feel free to use that chat box on your screen and fill in those questions, and we'll get those to the end. But why are you here? What we're going to do in this webinar is we're going to connect the technology to situational awareness training that you may have had back when you were in the Recruit Academy. We'll talk about how situational awareness can be positively and negatively affected by that technology in the patrol car, as well as carried by officers when they're trying to do patrol. We'll talk a little bit about best practices and some of the research, or more accurately, the lack thereof, relating to situational awareness and technology. And then we're also going to talk about how to move forward. Where do you go from this presentation, and what do you do with your own department? How do you make sure that you build accountability into your systems? How do you make sure that when you roll out a new piece of technology, that it's there to stay and that it's there to do good things for your personnel? A quote that I like to put in a lot of my presentations, more so for the emergency management side, but it's totally applicable here with law enforcement too, is a quote that says, "By the time you hear the thunder, it's too late to build the ark." And essentially, I love that quote because I think it's very visual. It speaks to how reactive we tend to be in emergency management, in public safety, as well as in general law enforcement. And so by the time you hear the thunder, it's too late to build the ark. It's too late to actually start thinking about the ways to fix these problems. So we're hoping that as a result of this conversation today, as a result of this webinar, you can take that proactive approach and start building accountability into your systems and start thinking about where we go from here with regard to situational awareness and distracted patrol. So we're going to lead with this stat right here. This is from the Officer Down Memorial page. You can actually view that website over there on the right. We have the website that we got this from. And so you can see here a comparison of line of duty deaths, or LODDs, from 2000 to 2014. You see here with firearms, you have 788 during that time, and vehicle-related line of duty deaths, 1,000, over 1,000. And so one of the things that we talk about when we're looking at distracted patrol, we're looking at distracted driving, technology usage while the vehicle is in motion. We talk about all these other things. But in reality, if we think about where we spend our time, where the research is done, where actual law enforcement professionals are focusing on, we tend to err on the side of firearms. We go and look at research study after research study talking about officer-involved shootings. We start talking about the huge bodies of research, the training that's out there related to firearms, related to the weapons that we use in patrol and in our lives in law enforcement and public safety. But distracted patrol is something that we don't always talk about. There's almost no injury on the number, or almost no numbers on the number of injuries. The equipment costs when we have officer-involved accidents relating to technology, relating to distracted patrol. And yet, why is it that we're focusing in this area and not in others, right? And Tim, you want to add something to this as well?
I do, Chris. I think when we were putting together this presentation, this slide in particular really jumped out at me, and this statistic. We tend to think of police officers as sort of the action-orientated hero out there. We certainly see publicized when officers are killed in the line of duty as a result of firearms or some kind of violent act. And yet there's so little attention paid to this particular aspect of risk. And now we look at the bar graph, and you see that this actually eclipses firearms deaths in the line of duty. So I think that's where we want to focus some of our effort here, and some of the dialogue is about on this risk management perspective. I've read several reports leading up to today about this 1,001 deaths. And one report suggested that for every death in a crash, there are 100 individual police officers that sustain serious injury. That can mean loss of productivity, the loss of the officer, loss of property, liability issues. Another study suggested it may be as high as 200 per death. So these are important issues. It's not to suggest that every vehicle-related death involving a police officer has some direct connection to distraction. That's not the case. This is a high-risk job that we do, and certainly emergency driving is a critical component of that. But we want to perhaps open up the window here and look at distracted driving as some component of that we might have an ability to mitigate in some respect along the way. So I think that's important as we move forward. The public perception of police officers is derived highly from the Hollywood perspective, the CSIs. You're part of my generation, Adam 12 or Hill Street Blues. But nowhere have you ever seen a movie or a television program that suggests that a police officer is killed in a car crash on the way to a critical incident. And yet, we know that that occurs out there. So that's one of the things we want to stir some thought about here today.
Absolutely, and it's not that we don't focus on distracted driving at all. There are obviously coaching the emergency vehicle operator courses or emergency vehicle operations courses where we have officers go through that training, but technology is something that's largely ignored in that training. And I think with that, there's a false sense of security. L-Tron and I actually recently did some focus groups where we got officers involved, and we had between 8 or 12 people in a room, and we started talking, okay, when have you been distracted, and where do you think you're getting distracted most? Inside the vehicle, unsurprisingly, was the top issue that people brought up when we had those conversations. And I think one of the things that became an issue and was identified in these focus groups is that, we've been doing this for so long. If you look at the statistics, and this is from one of the agencies that's local to my area in New York, they said when they first put MDTs, or mobile data terminals, into the patrol car, they had a huge spike in officer-involved accidents, right? But then what ended up happening was, and this was cited during one of those focus groups, over time, those number of accidents started to taper off and they plateaued. And the response from this officer that brought this statistic to me was, well, we must have mastered it. And I think that's where we get into the false sense of security, and where, just because we're not seeing all of these things all the time, maybe in our own individual agencies, it's saying that this doesn't happen to us. And I think that goes back to just a basic human understanding or a basic human misconception, which is called optimism bias. We truly believe that we're infallible, that we're invincible. And I think that is another reason why when we compare these two stats and we start to look very critically at our own operation, we'll start to see that there are very large risks that we need to pay attention to. So this is not a hard statistic. You may have 60%, you may do 80%, but in general we tend to think about the amount of time that the average police officer spends in their patrol car, around about 70%. And when you look at that and you compare these two statistics back and forth to each other, it's not surprising that when we get new pieces of technology that officers become distracted. That, okay, now we need to move the vehicle. We need to actually operate the vehicle safely. We need to obviously do our job patrolling and keeping track of the things that are on the road, watch for hazards, watch for suspicious activity. We need to respond to the calls that are coming through on our radio or on our mobile data terminal, right? We need to do all these things, and somehow the technology needs to improve the way that we do our job and not get in the way. And sometimes that's easier said than done. And so one of the things that we wanted to look at is that, why are we focusing so much of our time on the technology and not just on the basics? When we look at the training that law enforcement professionals, and in general in public safety, what type of training goes into our recruits? Do we give them technology-specific training, or is it, as it was explained to me, open this program by right-clicking on it and there you go? Right, so where do we go from here to say, all right, traffic incident management is important, technology is important, where do you roll it all together? And we're going to give you specific recommendations, specific best practices as we go through this webinar. Before we do that, though, let's talk about the change in the patrol car. And the Colonel talked about how when he first started in law enforcement, the world was a lot different. We didn't have as many technologies. The patrol cars themselves were different, and I think we should examine that. So Tim, I'm going to turn it right back on over to you, and let's talk about the way that the patrol car used to be, the amount of technology in the cars, and how that has impacted law enforcement as we've gone through the years.
Great. Well, this is where I date myself, Chris. Look at this. I mean, this is a 1980s vintage Crown Victoria, which very familiar to everyone that was in police work during that decade, and before and after. look at the interior of this. Big car, right? Rear-wheel drive, big split front bench seat, one radio, one set of controls for emergency lighting and siren and so forth. But very little beyond that. In Massachusetts, we didn't start with prisoner restraint cages until 1983. In fact, air conditioning wasn't even a standard option until 1981. So people would drive around with their windows open during the good weather and summertime back in that particular era. Lots of room. The vision lines inside this car were excellent, and that's why everyone gravitated towards this large sedan, whether it was a Ford or Chevy, a Chrysler, etc. But that changed. And if you can go to the next slide, we'll zoom forward to 2015. And suddenly, we've got the implementation of airbag systems in these cars that require that all of the electronics now be mounted closer to the floor in the center between two split bucket seats. And then mobile data terminals, which really changed so much the operation of a police officer out there in the street, giving them access, unlimited access to the kinds of information that you used to have to use your radio for. In 2011, Ford, for example, the last manufacturer of a large sedan, stopped making the Crown Victoria. 2011 was the last year. And so in 2012, in my own agency, we evaluated, the new frames, the Taurus, the Chevy Impala, the Dodge Charger, and then we looked at SUVs. The cruiser-mounted radios had gone from 1 to 2. The prisoner restraint compartments got smaller because the vehicle interior, the cubic inch that was available had shrunk. Mobile data terminals were originally large and clunky by the mid-2005 era. The Panasonic Toughbook, you've all seen those. They're very, very big. They have to be mounted on a very large frame. Low jack receivers would be in some of these. Individual officers are now bringing their own GPSs because they're not provided by the department, mounting those in the car. Officers have personal cell phones. And then we have patrol rifles and locking systems in that car. So a lot had changed from 1980s until 2015. And we see sort of that evolution of it. If you go to the next slide, there's an actual visual image of this. A 1995 Chevrolet Caprice, right? Everything's on the floor, but still adequate amount of room, a big interior car. By 2007, that had changed significantly. By 15, the MDT is starting to get a little bit smaller, but still takes up a considerable amount of room. One of the last things before I left the state police, our fleet people started looking at this integrated command system where some manufacturers are actually looking at installing these inside the dashboard of some of these manufactured vehicles. And that one happens to be a Ford SUV. And so there's a gradual sort of migration to thinking about this, about thinking about a response vehicle that has migrated into an office space on wheels, if you will. And it's changed significantly how we work. We're all about technology. We're all about productivity. We're all about access to information. This is the thrust of police work in this age. But we have to be very cautious about what the other implications of that, the sort of collateral issues that come along with this technology are for our police officer inside this car. Go ahead, Chris.
Thanks. And I think this is a really dramatic kind of showing here with these images. You look at the image all the way on the left, and I see a pretty comfortable ride. There's not too much going on. Like you said, the line of sight is great. Looking over 2007, 2015, it starts to feel pretty claustrophobic. And I think, we've gotten used to that. We've gotten almost a little bit blind in law enforcement as well as in other emergency response agencies too. When you look at, in my realm, in the fire service, we have technology that's crowding both the operator, the officer, and there's a lot of new responsibilities that we need to kind of come in there. And then we go and we look at the different types of technologies being used. The 07 there, I see a tough book, and we start to talk about different pieces of technology, and do they always work the way that we would expect them to? That adds mental distraction in addition to the physical distraction. And so there's a lot of different things that we need to be looking at here. Vehicle overcrowding is real. And you saw that in those images here, and we kind of have an example of some different things that we have to worry about in the vehicles now. You know, 1 or 2 different cell phones. Do we have the work phone and the personal phone? I'm sure every officer on the webinar here keeps their personal cell phone on silent or in a compartment where they don't look at, right? I'm being facetious here a little bit. You know, that's not realistic necessarily to expect that. We've had different people bring up best practices where they'll use different ringtones, where if it's a supervisor calling them or texting them as opposed to a friend or a family member. Do you have that expectation with your family that while you're on the job, you're not going to be responding to their personal texts or calls? You know, it's not always realistic to expect those different types of things, but we need to think about the environment that we're constructing while we're in this mindset. Do we have the patrol mindset, and are we fostering that with our technology, or is it an afterthought? We end up crowding the car with all these different things, the radios, cameras. Do we have the in-vehicle cameras? Do we have the body cameras now that are coming in? License plate reading technology, the flashlight, your weapon, all of these different technologies crowding the cab of the vehicle. I've heard of other law enforcement shops where they have to keep their rifle in the trunk, or they have to keep it away from the officer because there's just no room in that vehicle for them to do that. And so think of all the technology in your patrol car. Do you actually believe that it's helping you do your job, or is it getting in the way? And whose responsibility is it to make sure that this vehicle overcrowding stops, number one, and number two, that we can make it manageable? Think of an ergonomically designed patrol car. Do those exist these days, and is the technology actually improving that environment? I would say that if you look at it collectively, it's not. It doesn't really exist. You know, and certain technology providers are developing technology that will actually meet those needs, you know, whether it be a vehicle-mounted barcode scanner or a camera that's low profile on the dashboard, or you saw the MDT there where you can actually fold it closed and you don't have to worry about it breaking your sight line as long as you actually close it. Although we know that there's a big responsibility on the part of the officer as well, in that they have to actually do those things to make sure that it's not destroying their line of sight. You actually have to close the laptop when you're not using it. Do we do those things? Maybe yes, maybe no. But the point is to be seen here that these technologies are getting in the way sometimes, when really their goal is supposed to be to help law enforcement professionals do their job more effectively. No other activity that a police officer or trooper performs so regularly has such dangerous implications. Think about it. We're driving, you know, a lot of times at increased rates of speed. We may be proceeding through a controlled intersection. We may need to be thinking about situational awareness, right? All of these things are going through our head, and how do we maintain that situational awareness? How do we stave off distracted patrol? Thinking about individual officer safety, thinking about the safety of those around us. Okay, if you're going to a call, you're looking at your MDT, you're listening to the radio, you're driving the vehicle, you're preparing your body camera if you have one of those, you're thinking about all the things that you need to be doing. You may be radioing back to your headquarters or to your dispatcher. Right? All these different things are going through your head. What about the liability? What about risk management? How do we actually get all those things together? And let's talk about as well, not just in the vehicle, but this is a problem also for carried equipment. And Tim, I'm going to turn it back on over to you. Let's talk about all the different things that an officer is carrying on them while they're in the vehicle and outside.
Right, and this is really important. You know, we've, to this point, talked about the shrinking space inside of the vehicle itself, the headroom, the door space, etc. But now a lot has evolved in terms of the police officer, him or herself. So we have a firearm. That police officer today is wearing body armor. They've got ammunition pouches. They're carrying OC spray, handcuffs, probably 2 sets of handcuffs, an impact device, a collapsible baton of sorts. A taser might be on their belt, a flashlight, a portable radio, and in some cases now a body-worn video system. So now here you are, and you approach this vehicle with less space, and it's no longer that 1985 Crown Victoria where you can get in comfortably and you're able to turn around and manipulate whatever you need to. Now you're into essentially a cockpit space. carrying all this equipment on your person, if you will, in a vehicle that has less sight lines, less ability to maneuver around physically inside that vehicle itself, and then think about all of the information that's coming to you, either verbally or visually on an MDT. So the evolution of this police officer or this trooper has been quite profound. Now, I want to point out that every one of these things that I'm mentioning were important pieces of technology or improvements on a technology that evolved over a period of time. They're all valuable towards doing the job, but we sometimes as administrators look at, oh, we're going to get this piece of equipment, we're going to get that one, and without looking at the sort of collective impact that has on the workplace. We understand what the individual value of that piece of technology is. We know what an MDT and how it changed the work of a police officer, but we didn't think about what that MDT means with everything else that's going on in there. And I think that's the point where we have to sort of stop and look at this sort of collective accumulation of technology that suddenly here we are in 2015 and we find it's all there in one place at one time and potentially creating a distraction that places the officer and the public in some cases in harm's way. So that's what we want to do, is to raise that level of thinking about what we're adding sort of to the toolbox, if you will. I think, when we look at sort of the continuum of a lot of this, we've gone from larger vehicles, better visibility lines, less technology, and albeit fewer drivers on the roadway, 30 years ago, to a smaller vehicle frame, restricted sight lines, more technology, certainly higher expectations. If we're going to give this kind of technical equipment to folks, we expect that they're going to be able to use it and they're going to become more productive. They don't have to come back to the station to do a report anymore. They can do it in the car. They can run registrations and warrant checks and so forth right from the vehicle. All of that is add to the efficiency of the police officer. And then in some cases, that has transitioned over into some specialty units, like, say, canine, for example, where you've got a dog in the back of your car, and they're loud, and they're reactive, and they're looking at what's going on around them and reacting to that in some cases, adding even further distraction. If we look at the history of police officers killed in the line of duty, motorcycles is one of the most problematic areas, historically at least. And much of that goes back to the 1930s and 40s and 50s. But still, even today, we're seeing the loss of motorcycle officers because of the kind of congestion on our highways and all that's going around them as they affect the patrol out there. So there's a continuum of this that we have to start looking at individually in terms of that technology and what it's meant to our overall safety of our police officers.
Awesome. So what is distracted patrol? We have that as our headline for this slide deck. And I think what we're looking at here, and as you're starting to follow along with us and see this realm that we're dealing with here, distracted patrol is a symptom of a much larger issue. And so when we think about the shrinking of a patrol car, we think of the increased technologies that are out there. We come back to what are officers being trained to deal with these days. And so we talked about the mental distraction. We talked about the physical distraction. If you look at the average price for a civilian distracted driving ticket or a texting and driving ticket, the cost is between $50 to $450, depending on the infraction, depending on how many times it's happened in the past. That's the average price for a civilian to give a ticket that we probably give pretty frequently. Well, what's the cost or the risk for officer distracted driving, distracted patrol, and how do we combat that? One of the things that we looked at when developing this presentation and when just kind of evaluating this whole distracted patrol situational awareness environment is, well, what basic training is out there for recruits? What basic training is out there for your training officers? And so we looked at the OODA loop, which is something that certain recruit academies will discuss. That's the Observe, Orient, Decide, Act framework. It was originally developed by the military. A lot of law enforcement agencies use that to kind of talk about how you respond to different scenarios. How do you actually build that mindset so that way you're responding appropriately to the scenarios that are around you? Another one that we talked about quite a bit is the Cooper's color code, and this one isn't used as much, I don't think, but that's a color code range from white all the way over to red or black, where you have different frame of mind when you're responding to different incidents. So when you look on one side of it, the white color code is when you're relaxed, you're unaware of your surroundings, you're basically that whole ignorance is bliss frame of mind. That's where you're at when you're at white. When you start getting into yellow, into orange, that's when you become a little bit more aware of your surroundings. Your heart rate might be elevated. You might be thinking a little bit more about the people and the things that are around you. This is the type of mindset that all officers, all public safety professionals should have at all times, right? They should be alert and acutely aware of their surroundings, the people, the things. They should be anticipating the hazards around them and how things will be progressing. They should be looking for trends. All those different types of things go into basic situational awareness. When you get to the other side of Cooper's color code, you get into the red and the black. That's when you're actually in a physical altercation or you are surprised by your surroundings. Your heart rate is off the charts. You're not able to think as clearly. You are purely being reactive at that point in time. And that's what we want to avoid in law enforcement as well. And so when you think about this situational awareness training, when you talked about the OODA loop, when you talked about Cooper's color code, when you talked about watching your 6 or checking your 360, when did they talk about technology? When did they say, you need to keep your head up, you need to keep your head on a swivel, right? Not to use that cliche, but it's true. And how do they go about talking about maintaining perishable skills? Does your agency have those annual trainings? Do your field training officers actually deal with situational awareness? Do they give those kits, and do they talk about the technology implications of your job in the patrol car and beyond? One of the other things that we look at are accountability measures. Are our personnel actually accountable to their actions? Is distracted patrol something that we look at, and is it something that we are watching for trends in our agency? Are we over-relying on technology, or do we have a false sense of security with regard to our technology? This is something that I've seen quite a bit in my conversations with officers lately when we start talking about technology and when it doesn't work, right? If your NVT goes down, are you still able to do your job? If your tracks or your e-citation system or whatever system you might be using, if it goes down or if it stops working in a reliable way, are you familiar with and are you ready to go and start using those paper forms once again? All right, now paper is another form of technology, and I think we may have a little bit more familiarity with that, but if you're not used to doing it that way, is it going to slow you down? Are you going to be focusing on how to do these different things, or are you multitasking? Multitasking, I think, is probably one of the most dangerous things that we can do in the public safety environment, and yet we're expected to do it all the time. And there are some pretty significant risks. Are we using the devices while we're driving? Are we having a negative impact on our presence in the world? Are we using our computer as we're progressing through an intersection? Are we checking for hazards around us? Do we get tunnel vision, right? Tunnel vision can sometimes be a good thing, or not tunnel vision per se, but focusing on what your job is and the task at hand can be a good thing. But when we start becoming blind to our surroundings or we have mental distractions, information overload is a real risk these days. And so how do we respond to that, right? So Tim, I'll turn it on back over to you.
Well, this slide will be very brief because I think we've touched on this. This is the sensory overload that can, diminish your ability, if you will, to identify and respond to those kinds of threats that are all around you. I think of pursuit driving, and I'm going to touch on that as one of those examples where you as a human being tend to get tunnel vision about what's immediately in front of you and sort of lose track. There's been plenty of studies about human physiology and psychology that sort of test the limits of what a human being is able to multitask at the same time. If you could just go to the next slide, Chris, we make some recommendations about how your agency, through proper management, can begin the process of sort of mitigating this risk or compressing it to the extent that you can. So policy enhancements are one of the key things. And, this is one of the things that sure, line officers rarely want to hear, but administrators are always typically the bad guy in terms of implementing these. But they're very, very important, and they're all done for the sake of officer safety. So things like mandatory seatbelt usage in the car, accountability in tracking the performance of individual officers, who are your officers that have had a number of crashes, say, over a period of time? In Massachusetts State Police, we instituted a software program that actually tracked a lot of this, particularly for our newer officers, our probationary troopers, to see how they were adjusting to emergency response driving and who were having crashes and who weren't. And once you met a certain threshold, we would actually bring you back for some refresher or more emergency management driving. Pursuit management is a huge issue. In 2008, we instituted a policy by which the shift commander or duty officer actually took command and control of a pursuit, so that we take some of that away from the individual trooper or police officer in the car, where they got to ask a series of questions. You know, what's the violation? What are the road conditions? Is it thickly settled or not? What is the weather that prevails at that moment in time? So there's an active outside management of a pursuit. So there's three quick ones right there in terms of what can be done. Manufacturers' expansion of some of the technology. So I think in police vehicles we're going to have to go towards factory-installed Bluetooth capability, so that cell phones and some of this other equipment now can be integrated into one sort of stream of information that might be helpful to the operator of that car. More hands-free is going to be better for everyone. A policy even on hands-free driving. You know, in Massachusetts, there's not a law for citizens that they be hands-free, so it's kind of hard to look at implementing a policy in a police vehicle, but yet, with everything else that's going on, this may be indeed the next step. And then finally, you know, the increased use perhaps of driving simulators. You know, I'm struck by, and I think in the airline industry, commercial aviation, there are some great examples of risk management in the cockpit. Just over the weekend, an Aer Lingus flight going from New York to Ireland was sent back to New York to land because they had hydraulic problems. And I read this quote by the pilot, and he said, you know what, I've never dealt with that situation in an actual flight. The only place I've ever dealt with that was in a simulator. Imagine that. The first time he dealt with that particular problem was in a simulator. So why not expand, if we're talking about technology, the use of simulators that replicate the conditions inside a police vehicle? Make that part of basic training, of advanced training, of regular in-service training. I think that would be another viable option for mitigating some of this. If you could go to the next slide, Chris, that would be great. So, you know, when we look at liability or risk management and we compare officers lost from firearms as opposed to crashes, you know, I can tell you that as an agency head, you know, we had a policy that once every year you had to go to the range to demonstrate your proficiency and meet certain proficiency levels with the firearm. And yet we know that over the course of your career, you may never even unholster a weapon, let alone use one. That's the reality of policing. Yet you're far more likely to be involved in a motor vehicle crash of some sort. Our troopers here in Massachusetts do over 4 million miles of patrol miles annually, and yet we don't have any mechanism really to get them back for any kind of in-service emergency vehicle operation. We share a track with a private concern, and we're developing a sort of public-private partnership to utilize a driver track so that we can do more of this. But to this point, that has been sort of on the shelf and a secondary thought. Training's very expensive, and especially when you take people offline and bring them back. But when you think about the liability, when you think about settlements, when you think about loss of productivity or damage to vehicles or loss of vehicles, I think we would have a great chance here to compress a lot of this and make it much more cost-effective and safer for our people if we looked at regular emergency vehicle operation training on at least on an annual basis. I think would be well served. Go ahead, Chris.
I completely agree, Tim. I think there's a real importance to this that I think we can't understate. We're focusing a lot, I think, in the I would say the hot button topics. You know, we're looking at the media these days. We're looking at officer-involved shootings. We're looking at violence and all those different types of things. And I think we're getting distracted ourselves as an agency and as a collective industry, where we should be focusing a little bit more on how we can stop distracted patrol. So this is actually from a book by David Rock called Your Brain at Work. And these distractions that he's talking about in this book are more so for professionals in a work environment or in an office or things like that. But they're totally applicable here as well. So the first one here, minimize distractions early. Take a hard look, and this is your homework for today if you're listening. Take a hard look at how you operate in a patrol car, or if you're a training officer, take a look at how your officers are using technology, and think about what is becoming a distraction. What tendencies do you have? I was talking with a member of a campus law enforcement squad, and he was telling me about how he uses his iPad in the vehicle. He has a data terminal that he uses as well, but he likes to use his iPad because it's faster. And for that, he was talking about how proficient he is at using the iPad or the tablet in his vehicle, and he thought that it was a good thing. And then I told him to start thinking a little bit deeper in how he was using the technology, and he told me that he would also take it with him because he didn't want to leave it in the vehicle. And so he would take it with him, and he would stick it in his duty belt, kind of at the small of his back. And I asked him to think, has there ever been a time where you needed to move quickly, and has that restricted your movement? Has it gotten you distracted? Have you thought about those types of things? He said, I never really thought about it that way. And so look critically at the technology that you're inviting into your patrol car. Look critically at the technology that you're wearing on your belt, and think, is it doing you favors or is it not? Reduce the volume and speed of information. Think about all the different sights and sounds and things that are going around a patrol car and understand your limitations. Everyone processes information differently. The presence of distracted patrol may vary in your agency from shift to shift and may depend on whether you're in a suburban department versus a metro area. And think about all the different distractions that you might have to do. When you're at night, right, if you're operating at night, if you're on a nighttime patrol or you're on that shift, you may have a little bit more luxury of time to go and pay a little bit more attention. We tend to be a little bit more aware of our surroundings in those areas because maybe the calls aren't happening as quickly depending on your area. Maybe we have a little bit more space to deal with that, right? And so when we start looking at those things, think about all the different stressors, internal and external, to think about, all right, this is actually becoming a distraction. How do I reduce that? How do I mitigate the effects of that technology on my day-to-day life? And how do I start managing the technology instead of allowing it to manage me? That's a really critical piece in this as well. So we have some tips here, and I'm going to call on Tim too to talk with me about these things. I think if we use these tips and we start thinking about more best practices, we'll start to build this accountability into our day-to-day operations. So when you're driving, number one, focus on driving safely. It seems like an obvious concern, but chances are you're thinking about the next call that you have to get to. You're thinking about how to get there. You're thinking about all these other things that are going on in your head. And driving can sometimes turn into this autopilot mentality, and that's pretty dangerous. Whenever we start snapping into that realm of thought, we slow down our reaction times. We slow down how we're going to respond to different stressors and different external factors when we're operating a vehicle. Avoid technology use if possible if you're driving. If the vehicle's moving, close the laptop, close the phone, just try to get away from those things. And don't over-rely on the technology in your vehicle either. A key idea with this is with license plate readers. We were talking with law enforcement professionals who had license plate readers in their vehicle, and they had noticed that some officers were becoming overly dependent on them. And if the license plate reader didn't flag a vehicle, if it didn't say, bing, that this vehicle is someone that you have to go and pull over, if this is not what's happening with the technology, they forgot to actually look at the vehicle and look for indicators. They forgot to look at, okay, is this vehicle behaving strangely? Are the windows tinted? Are those types of things, all those stuff that we look for. Dim the screens in your vehicle. Mute or reduce the volume of your communications channels. One agency that we were discussing this with, they have EMS radios in their apparatus, and they said, okay, when we're not going on an EMS call, we actually turn that radio all the way down because we don't need to hear it as much. And a big part of this is just knowing your limits and be alert to changing conditions. When you're parked, number one, you got to find a good place to park. A lit parking lot with the windows down. If you back the vehicle up into an area where if you have a favorite parking lot, which a lot of officers do, or a favorite maybe overpass where you like to kind of hide behind, that's a pretty good place to be, but don't lure yourself into a false sense of security. When you get to that place, you need to establish a baseline. Spend a little bit of time figuring out how things look. Notice if things are out of place, so that way when you can go back and check and make sure that things aren't changing and getting out of control. Vehicle cabin lights on or off. It kind of depends on where you are. You don't want to ruin your night vision. That's one of the main things that you want to do. So that's why we said in the other section, dim your electronics, right? Stay organized and use the buddy system as well. Check your surroundings as often as you can, and if you can do that, get some people together. Get a few different patrol cars together if you can. Alternate your position and take turns looking around and making sure that you stay secure. The buddy system is something that we can all kind of use here. And when you're outside of the vehicle, minimize the use of technology if you can. If you're going up to make a stop, don't carry the laptop with you unless you really, really have to. You want to be focused on the dangers and the hazards that are at hand, right? Situate your technology and the tools prior to leaving your vehicle. Maintain that line of sight. Look up, look down, look around, and be careful of tunnel vision. And that's just a general tip for regardless of technology use. Just watch out for yourself and pay attention to the things that are happening around you. Tim, you have anything else to add with these?
Well, I've got to go back to add to one of my, about all the equipment in the car. You mentioned license plate readers. I hadn't included that, Chris, so that's a good catch on your part. You know, I think we've seen across this country the rash sort of police officers that have been killed outside of their car. That's a great point. You know, we went to new ANSI compliant patrol jackets and vests that, and I remember anecdotally going back a few years ago, you know, one of my colleagues said to me, well, I don't want to wear this reflective stuff outside because I make a good target for somebody with a weapon. But that goes back to this entire mindset about what the threat really is, that the threat from being killed by an oncoming vehicle or in a roadway is substantially more profound than from a firearm. And so we have to think about it and change some of our thinking process as we move forward. And so that's the only thing I would add. I think these are all great suggestions, Chris. So moving forward, you know, I think we've touched on a lot of the issues that are really important towards this risk management process. Training and exercises, getting back annually to do some emergency vehicle operations. Accountability programs about looking for problematic behavior, perhaps a pattern of driving that is concerning to a particular department. Contingency planning. Emergency vehicle operation refreshers. Now, whether that's an in-service training program or perhaps in the future moving more towards simulating simulators that can be mobile and brought around to various departments or locations in a department to facilitate some of this. You know, we have representatives in our agency that sit on the boards of Ford and General Motors and Chrysler making recommendations about vehicle manufacturing. You know, look, we're going to be dealing with some kind of stock vehicle no matter what. There is not a particular police vehicle that's produced out there. There's modifications to drivetrain and horsepower and, you know, suspension, but it's all within a frame that's available to the public. So, you know, but we've got to emphasize these sight lines as being incredibly important. I think the new SUV platform has actually gone a long way to address some of that, but I think we need to do even more as we go forward. And clearly, there needs to be a whole lot more research on this topic of distracted driving. There's so little that's available out there. Again, I go back to what I said originally. For every death, there's somewhere between 100 and 200 injuries, substantial injuries to police officers, in addition to the public, that are attributable to crashes. And if we can work towards compressing that, mitigating those circumstances, I think everybody is going to be better served for that.
I completely agree. And the other thing that I want to add, too, is there are some blogs and white papers, and thanks to our sponsor, L-Tron Corporation here, for helping us put this webinar together. We have some white papers, some blogs and things that are out there, and we're trying, and I know a lot of law enforcement professionals are trying to bring this more to the forefront and start these conversations. So whether that be with training and exercises, whether that be with just getting some bodies of research out there, have the conversation with your personnel. If you're a training officer, bring this into your roll call training or bring it into any sort of training program that you might have at your department. Start thinking about these things and use the resources that are out there. Even though there aren't that many, that's no excuse. We really need to start taking care of ourselves and using this and looking at the technology with a critical lens, making sure that we're moving forward at a sustainable pace. And so just to close out here, distracted patrol can be greatly reduced through risk management. Risk management is typically something that, a word or a phrase used by the pencil pushers up in the office. But really it's something that we should all look at for officer safety. It's something that distracted patrol, it should be near and dear to your heart, right? So just think about that as you're moving forward and use the resources in this webinar and all those around you to make sure that you stay safe, make sure that you're looking up, down, around, make sure that you're checking your 360, and make sure that you're staying safe out there while you're on the street. Don't become a victim of distracted patrol. So we do have some time here for Q&A. I think we got about 8 minutes or so left. And so, what questions do we have out there, Frank?
Chris, we've got a few. Before I get to the questions, Colonel, did you have any closing remarks on the risk management slide at all?
No, I think I've summed it up through the course of my part of the presentation. So I think we've hit on all those main pockets, Frank. Thank you.
Fair enough. Then I'm going to direct actually the first question to you because you're coming from the outside, the law enforcement side, into the technology side. How can police departments, in your opinion, contribute to the research that's done? Is there new data that needs to be compiled?
I think there is. I think this is a substantial gap out there in clearly understanding what this risk is. I mean, we have the data in terms of police officers killed in the line of duty in vehicle crashes. Certainly departments out there have a mountain of data in terms of how many crashes they sustain in a year. They have the information on how many officers are injured and so forth, settlements, litigation that occurs as a result of all this. I think now it's drawing that together. So I think collectively, if we could get a sort of spearhead here in terms of looking at more research on this topic, we certainly surmise what it's doing in the public sector in terms of distracted driving. It's got to have a effect here in our business as well.
Right. Chris, I want to direct the same question to you, and then we have one more that this is a very important question. So same question, what do you think that the law enforcement agencies can do to contribute back as far as research and distracted patrol?
I would mirror Tim's comments. I think the Colonel really summed it up nicely. We need more data, number one. I think that's going to be the driving force with a lot of these things, a lot of these questions that we position in this webinar. The other thing I would say, and when you're looking through the materials I mentioned, the white papers and the case studies and things like that, you can feel free to reach out to us as well as to L-Tron, where we're trying to get some focus groups together and get these conversations out there and build a body of knowledge and start having these conversations more frequently. But I think the initial step, just like the Colonel said, is to get more data around this and start bringing this to the top of mind.
Okay. The question that came in that I wanted to address is coming from a gentleman at the Rocky Mount Police Department, and the question is how many of the vehicle deaths were due to a pursuit? Now, I think this is a number that's available through the FBI UCR reports, and I'd encourage them to look there. Do either of you have any information on what percentage of those deaths were actually attributable to pursuit?
I don't have any familiarity with that specific issue, Frank. I don't know how many are attributed to it. I can tell you that in 2008, one of the impetuses to our policy was a death that occurred, to a private citizen as a result of a pursuit, not to the police officer. And I think we've seen that around the country.
Absolutely. Chris,
yeah,
do you have any information on it? Okay.
Same here. I don't have a specific number breakdown with those, but I think that also comes back to our previous notion, which is that we need to start focusing on not just that it's a vehicle or an officer-involved vehicle collision, but break it down and start looking at the root causes of those. Was it a pursuit? I think that's a really important question. Was it technology-induced? Was it just general distraction? One thing we kind of touched on really briefly, look at shift length, look at the timing of our shifts. Are we overworking our people? Are they just exhausted, right? And then when you pair that with the technology questions, that can create a really dangerous environment as well. So I think we need to look at it with a more critical lens.
Yeah, when you have a fatigued officer who then is a distracted fatigued officer, it gets very bad.
Yeah.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for your expertise in today's presentation. For our listeners, I hope you found this very informative. Remember that it's going to be archived on officer.com for a year. So if there's somebody who wasn't able to view it that you think would benefit from it, please do refer them. Come back and take a look at it yourself. Feel free to use it as reference material. And if you have any questions or comments after the fact, reach out to L-Tron, and they are very good about getting information back to you. Thank you for attending this presentation on distracted patrol, presented by Officer.com, sponsored and supported by L-Tron Corporation. I would encourage you to stay safe on the streets and come back to get educated some more. Stay safe.
Thanks, everybody.